On his wedding day, a powerful CEO publicly humiliated a poor old man and had him thrown out. What he didn't know was that the poor man was his own billionaire father, who had secretly been testing him for 10 years. Why would a father fake losing everything just to watch his son? And what happened next will shock you. Make sure you like this video, subscribe, and stay tuned, because this story will change the way you see success forever. Daniel Loron stood at the edge of the ballroom balcony, looking down at a sea of diamonds, champagne glasses, and hollow smiles. The city lights shimmered behind him like a kingdom he had conquered, and in many ways, he had. At 58, he was worth billions. His real estate empire stretched across continents. Politicians sought his approval. News anchors spoke his name with reverence. But none of it mattered in that moment. Inside the grand hall, his only son Adrian laughed loudly with a group of investors, his tailored tuxedo sharp, his posture confident, his voice edged with something Daniel could not ignore: arrogance. Daniel stayed in the shadows, listening. "Poor people stay poor because they don't think big," Adrian said, swirling his drink. "If they work smarter, they wouldn't be begging for handouts." The group chuckled. Someone added, "Must be easy when your father built an empire." Adrian smirked. "I'm not my father. I'm bigger." The words hit Daniel harder than any financial loss ever could. Bigger or emptier? Daniel remembered the nights he missed bedtime stories because he was closing deals, the birthdays attended through video calls, the way he compensated absence with expensive gifts, cars at 16, luxury watches at 18, a penthouse at 21. He thought he was giving his son opportunity. Had he been feeding entitlement instead? The music swelled as the host called Daniel to the stage for a speech honoring his philanthropy. Applause thundered when he stepped into the light. Cameras flashed. Adrian barely looked up from his phone. Daniel spoke about responsibility, about building communities, about remembering humble beginnings. As he talked, his eyes kept drifting to his son. There was no pride there, no connection, only impatience. After the speech, Daniel approached Adrian. "Walk with me," he said quietly. Adrian sighed but followed him to the balcony. "You embarrass me up there," Adrian muttered. Daniel blinked. "Embarrass you? All that talk about humility. It sounds weak. This world respect power. Dad." The word dad felt transactional. Daniel studied his son's face, the sharp jawline, the confident gaze, the ambition burning bright. He saw himself at that age. But something was missing. Compassion. "Power without character is dangerous," Daniel said softly. Adrian shrugged. "Character doesn't close billion-dollar deals." The wind brushed past him, carrying the distant noise of traffic below. Daniel felt an unfamiliar heaviness in his chest. He had built tower from dust, negotiated with titans, survived economic crashes. Yet he had no strategy for this. "Tell me something," Daniel asked. "If I lost everything tomorrow, what would you do?" Adrian laughed. "You won't." "Hypothetically." Adrian's expression hardened. "I'd rebuild, and I wouldn't make the mistakes you did." Daniel nodded slowly. "And me?" Adrian frowned. "What about you? Would you stand beside me?" Adrian checked his watch. "Dad, don't be dramatic. We're Lorons. We don't lose." Adrian walked back inside, leaving Daniel alone with a question that now refused to quiet. What if we did? That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He wandered through his mansion, past marble floors and priceless art, and paused a family portrait taken years ago. Adrian was 10, smiling genuinely, clutching his father's hand. When had that grip loosened? Daniel entered his private study and opened a drawer containing old letters from his own father, a factory worker who taught him that dignity mattered more than dollars. "Money tests a man," one letter read. Daniel whispered the words aloud. "Money tests a man." Had Adrian ever truly been tested? Or had wealth insulated him from becoming whole? By dawn, Daniel made a decision that terrified him more than any risky investment ever had. He would remove the insulation, not by lecturing, not by threatening, but by disappearing. If Adrian believed power defined worth, then Daniel would strip power away from himself. Only then would he see who his son truly was. The sun rose over the city skyline, casting gold across the towers Daniel owned. For the first time, those buildings looked fragile. And so did his legacy. The plan began with silence. Daniel Loron had learned long ago that the most powerful moves were never announced. They were executed. Within weeks, confidential meetings were held behind closed doors with his most trusted lawyer, Margaret Wells, and his lifelong butler, Thomas, who had served the Loron family for over 3 decades. "You're asking to dismantle your own empire," Margaret said carefully, reviewing documents in Daniel's study. "Not dismantle," Daniel corrected. "Hide." Offshore trusts were reinforced. Assets were transferred quietly into protected foundations. Ownership structures shifted like pieces on a chessboard. Publicly, however, a different story was unfolding. Select investments began to fail. Strategic withdrawals triggered market panic. Anonymous rumors spread about internal instability. Daniel allowed the illusion to build. Then came the headline that shook the financial world. Loron Holdings faces massive liquidity crisis. Adrian stormed into the study, newspaper in hand. "Tell me this isn't real," he demanded. Daniel looked tired, intentionally so. The markets turned. Some partners pulled out. "How could you let this happen?" Adrian's voice wasn't fearful. It was furious. Daniel studied him closely. No concern for employees. No concern for family. Only reputation. "Loss is part of business," Daniel replied quietly. "Then you weren't strong enough." The words were sharp, calculated. They cut deep, but Daniel let them. Over the next month, the collapse accelerated. Properties were sold. Stocks plummeted. The mansion was listed. Media vans camped outside the gates. Commentators speculated wildly. Some called Daniel a genius who had simply miscalculated. Others labeled him reckless and outdated. Adrian avoided public appearances at first, then re-emerged with a new narrative. "I intend to rebuild what was lost," he told reporters. "This setback does not define me." Not us. Me. The difference did not escape Daniel. The night before Daniel's stage departure, he sat across from Adrian at a now nearly empty dining table. The staff had been dismissed. The art had been removed. Echoes filled the once vibrant hall. "I may need to step away for a while," Daniel said, "to handle what's left." Adrian didn't look up from his tablet. "Do what you have to do." Daniel waited. Nothing more came. No offer of support. No "I'll help." Just distance. The following morning, a final press conference was held. Daniel appeared thinner, subdued. "Business carries risk," he told the flashing cameras. "Sometimes we fall. What matters is how we rise." Reporters shouted questions as he stepped away without answering. That was the last public sighting of Daniel Loron. Privately, he boarded a quiet car driven by Thomas. No security convoy. No headlines. Just a single suitcase beside him. "Are you certain, so?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling slightly. Daniel looked out at the city one last time. "If I stay, he'll never learn. If I leave, maybe he will." They drove not to a private jet, but to a modest train station hours away. Daniel removed his tailored suit jacket and replaced it with a plain coat. His expensive watch came off. His wedding ring was tucked into a small box. From today, Margaret had advised, "You are David Lewis." A rented apartment in a quiet industrial town awaited him. A job had already been arranged through a small maintenance company. No special treatment. No hidden luxuries. As the train pulled away, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in decades: uncertainty. For the first time since his 20s, no one would recognize him. No one would open doors automatically. No one would fear or flatter him. Back in the city, Adrian stood in his new office, a smaller but ambitious startup space funded by aggressive investors who believe in his drive. He stared at the skyline and clenched his jaw. "I'll build something bigger," he whispered, "and I won't fail." He did not notice the absence of a father's shadow behind him. In the small town miles away, Daniel stepped off the train and inhaled cold, unfamiliar air. There were no cameras, no applause, just the sound of distant traffic and the hum of ordinary life. For the first time in decades, Daniel Loron had nothing, and for the first time, the real test had begun. 10 years passed, and the world forgot Daniel Lauron. Markets moved on. New billionaires replaced old headlines. In the financial districts of major cities, one name rose with relentless momentum: Adrian Lauron. At 35, Adrian had rebuilt an empire from what the public believed were ashes. But unlike his father's steady and patient expansion, Adrian's rise was aggressive, bold, and unapologetically ruthless. He specialized in hostile takeovers, restructuring failing companies with brutal efficiency. Employees called him brilliant. Competitors called him dangerous. The media called him the comeback prince. In interviews, Adrian often leaned back in his chair, confidence radiating from his posture. When asked about his father, he would pause briefly, then answer with polished detachment. "My father's failure taught me that sentiment has no place in business. I built this company with vision and discipline." The implication was clear. He had surpassed the old generation. In a modest town miles away, Daniel, known only as David Lewis, watched those interviews on a small second-hand television in his one-bedroom apartment. His hands were rough now, callous from years of maintenance work. He fixed boilers, cleaned hallways, repaired broken pipes in apartment complexes. He owned just enough to live simply. No one suspected that the quiet handyman once commanded boardrooms of global influence. Daniel observed his son carefully, not as a critic but as a student of character. He saw the sharp mind, the strategic brilliance. Adrian had indeed become powerful. Revenues climbed yearly. Investors trusted him. But Daniel also saw something else: the tightening jaw when challenged, the dismissive tone toward employees during leaked meetings, the pattern of layoffs executed without transition plans. Adrian rewarded loyalty only when it served profit. He measured worth in output. One evening, Daniel sat at a small diner after a long shift. A waitress accidentally spilled coffee on his worn jacket. She apologized repeatedly, afraid of losing tips. Daniel smiled gently. "It's just coffee. Don't worry." He left a generous tip anyway. Across town, Adrian fired a senior manager for a single failed projection. "Excuses are expensive," Adrian said coldly. The contrast deepened with every passing year. Daniel wondered if his absence had hardened Adrian further instead of softening him. But he remained patient. This was a long test, not a quick lesson. Adrian's company went public in its 7th year. The IPO was explosive. Financial analysts praised his leadership. Social media buzzed with admiration. Luxury magazines featured his penthouse, his custom cars, his tailored suits. Adrian had become everything he once claimed he would be: bigger. But when celebrations ended and cameras disappeared, Adrian often found himself staring out his office window in silence. Success filled his schedule, but not his thoughts. Occasionally, late at night, he would remember the balcony conversation with his father. He dismissed it quickly. Weakness had no place in his present. Meanwhile, Daniel followed every milestone quietly through business journals at the local library. Pride and concern wrestled inside him. His son had proven capability. But had he proven character? Daniel knew the final test would not be about money. It would be about humanity. And life was preparing the stage for that moment. The announcement came unexpectedly, splashed across headlines and social feeds. Adrian Lauron engaged Victoria Hale. Victoria was the daughter of Charles Hale, a powerful magnate in international shipping. The union wasn't just romantic, it was strategic. The wedding was projected to be the social event of the decade, merging two modern empires. Adrian stood before cameras with Victoria at his side, her elegance complementing his authority. "We're excited to begin this new chapter," Adrian said smoothly. Victoria smiled, though her eyes revealed a quieter personality beneath the glamour. Unlike Adrian, she had spent time volunteering abroad, working with non-profit organizations. She admired ambition but valued empathy. It was something she occasionally wished Adrian expressed more openly. Wedding preparations began immediately. A historic estate was booked. Guest lists included politicians, celebrities, CEOs. The estimated cost rivaled the GDP of a small nation. Sponsors discreetly aligned themselves with the spectacle. It wasn't just a wedding. It was branding. In his small apartment, Daniel read the announcement twice. His son was getting married. A milestone he had once imagined attending proudly, standing in the front row as father of the groom. Instead, he sat alone at a kitchen table with peeling paint. He traced Adrian's photo in the newspaper gently. 10 years had changed his son's face, sharper, more guarded. Daniel felt an ache deeper than regret. He had chosen this path, believing distance would cultivate growth. Now he wondered if absence had created a permanent divide. For days, he wrestled with the idea forming in his mind. Should he attend? Not as Daniel Lauron. That identity remained legally sealed, known only to a few. But as David Lewis, the man Adrian would see as ordinary, perhaps even beneath him. It would be the final measure. Margaret, still overseeing Daniel's concealed fortune, warned him over a secure call. If you go, you must be prepared for anything. Daniel nodded, though she couldn't see him. That's the point. The invitation list was exclusive, but Daniel knew the venue location. He purchased a simple gift, a modest watch engraved with the words, "Character is what you are when no one is watching." He wore his cleanest but still worn suit. In the mirror, he saw not a billionaire, but a man weathered by time and humility. Meanwhile, Adrian reviewed seating charts obsessively. Every guest represented influence. Every detail reflected status. Make sure security is tight, he instructed his team. No surprises. Victoria watched him quietly. It's our wedding, she reminded him gently. Not a shareholders' meeting. Adrian smiled but didn't fully hear her. The wedding day approached with global anticipation. Daniel packed the engraved watch into a small box and placed it carefully in his coat pocket. Tomorrow would reveal what 10 years had truly built. The estate shimmered under crystal chandeliers and strings of imported lights. Luxury cars lined the long driveway. Guests arrived in designer gowns and tailored suits, stepping onto red carpets as photographers captured every angle. Music floated across manicured gardens where fountains sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Inside, Adrian stood at the altar in a custom tuxedo, composed and commanding. Victoria, radiant in white, held a bouquet of rare orchids. Everything was perfect, precise, curated, controlled. At the entrance gates, a security guard frowned at an elderly man in a modest suit holding a small gift box. "Invitation," the guard asked firmly. David, shook his head gently. "I'm here to see the groom. It's important." The guard studied his worn shoes, his age coat. "This is a private event." Daniel hesitated, then said softly, "Please, just tell him an old friend came." Something in his tone carried quiet dignity. After a tense pause, another staff member reluctantly allowed him to stand near the back of the outdoor ceremony, far from the VIP section. Whispers rippled as guests noticed him. He didn't belong to their polished world. Daniel kept his eyes fixed on Adrian. 10 years of distance collapsed into one overwhelming moment. Pride, sorrow, hope, all tangled inside him. The officiant began. Vows were exchanged. Applause erupted as Adrian and Victoria were pronounced husband and wife. Cameras flashed. Champagne flowed. As guests mingled, Daniel stepped forward slowly, navigating clusters of wealthy elites who subtly shifted away from him. Finally, Adrian noticed the unfamiliar figure approaching. His smile faded. "Can I help you?" Adrian asked, irritation creeping into his voice. Daniel looked at him, heart pounding but face calm. "I just wanted to congratulate you. You've built a remarkable life." Adrian glanced around, aware of curious eyes watching. "Do I know you?" Daniel swallowed. "Once." Adrian stiffened. The modest clothing, the aged face, it registered only as inconvenience. "This is a private event," Adrian said sharply. "You shouldn't be here." Victoria looked between them, sensing tension. "Adrian, maybe—" "Security," Adrian interrupted. 2 guards approached. Daniel's grip tightened slightly on the small gift box. He met his son's eyes one last time and said quietly, "I'm proud of you, son." The word hung in the air like a fragile thread. Adrian froze for half a second, confusion flickering across his face, but pride overpowered it. "Remove him," he ordered. Guests pretended not to stay as security escorted Daniel away. The engraved watch slipped slightly inside its box as his hand trembled. He did not resist. He did not reveal himself. As he was led past the gates, Daniel glanced back once. Adrian had already turned away, greeting investors with a polished smile. Outside the estate walls, Daniel stood alone on the roadside as distant laughter echoed from within. 10 years of waiting had led to this moment, and the answer was clear. The iron gates closed with a heavy metallic sound that echoed deeper than the noise of the wedding band inside. Daniel stood on the gravel road outside the estate, the distant glow of celebration flickering beyond walls that might as well have been miles high. For a brief moment, his legs felt weak, not from age, but from the weight of what had just happened. He had prepared himself for rejection. He had told himself this was only a test. But nothing truly prepares a father to be dismissed by his own son in front of hundreds of watching eyes. Inside the estate, laughter resumed quickly. The orchestra swelled. Crystal glasses clinked. Adrian forced a smile as investors surrounded him. Unexpected gate crashes. One guest joked lightly. Adrian chuckled. Security will handle it. But Victoria was quiet. She had heard the old man's final words clearly. I'm proud of you, son. There had been no sarcasm in the voice, only sincerity. Did you know him? She asked softly once they were alone for a moment. Adrian adjusted his cufflinks. No, probably someone looking for money. He said it quickly, too quickly. Victoria studied his face. He didn't look like someone asking for money. Adrian's jaw tightened. It's irrelevant. The reception continued in full spectacle. Fireworks planned to explode over the lake, a 5-tiered cake flown in from Paris, a surprise performance from a world-famous singer. Guests posted glamorous photos online with captions about power couples and unstoppable empires. Yet beneath Adrian's confident exterior, something unsettled him. There had been something familiar in the man's eyes. Not recognition, more like memory. Outside the estate, Daniel remained standing for several minutes before walking slowly toward the main road. The small gift box was still in his coat pocket. He had not been able to hand it over. A car passed, then another, drivers unaware that the man walking along the shoulder had once owned half the skyline in the city behind them. He reached a bus stop bench and sat down heavily. For 10 years he had waited to see whether his son would choose compassion over image. He replayed the scene in his mind. The sharp tone, the command to remove him, the quick dismissal to protect reputation. There had been no hesitation long enough to matter. Daniel did not feel anger. He felt clarity. Back at the reception, a group of executives laughed as one of them exaggerated the story of the confused old man. Adrian forced himself to laugh along, but his mind kept drifting back to the word son. The man had said it with quiet certainty, not as a guess, not as flattery, as truth. You're distracted, Victoria whispered later during their first dance. Just tired, Adrian replied. But he wasn't tired. He was unsettled. Meanwhile, Daniel boarded a late bus back toward the small town he now called home. He stared at the gift box in his hands. Slowly, he opened it and looked at the engraved watch. Character is what you are when no one is watching. He closed the lid gently. Now I know, he murmured to himself. The final test had been answered, not in private, not under pressure of poverty, but in the brightest spotlight of success. And under that light, Adrian had chosen image over humanity. The wedding trended for days. Photos of the extravagant ceremony flooded social media feeds. News outlets praised a strategic alliance between the Lauron and Hale empires. Commentators analyzed the economic implications of the marriage. No one mentioned the old man escorted out by security. It had been a minor disturbance in a perfectly curated event. But for Adrian, the memory refused to disappear. On the honeymoon flight to the Amalfi Coast, Victoria leaned against the window watching clouds drift below. Adrian scrolled through congratulatory messages on his phone. Investors, politicians, celebrities. Yet his thoughts kept circling back to a single sentence spoken in a trembling but steady voice. I'm proud of you, son. He told himself it meant nothing. Still, he found himself replaying the man's expression, the lack of bitterness, the absence of pleading. It hadn't been desperation. It had been disappointment? No, not even that. Something softer. Later that evening in Italy, while standing on a balcony overlooking the sea, Victoria finally asked again, "Why did that moment bother you?" Adrian leaned on the railing. "It didn't." "Adrian." Her tone was calm but firm. He exhaled slowly. "It was inappropriate. That's all." He looked at you like he knew you. Adrian turned away. Lots of people think they know me. Victoria stepped closer. You didn't have to humiliate him. The word hung in the air. Humiliate. Adrian felt irritation rise. I protected our event. From what? An old man with a gift. Silence stretched between them. Adrian walked back inside without answering. Across the ocean, Daniel resumed his routine. He woke before dawn, put on his work boots, and repaired a leaking pipe in an aging apartment building. He greeted tenants kindly. He fixed a broken stair rail for an elderly widow without charging extra hours. He volunteered at a small community center on weekends, helping teenagers with job applications. None of them knew his history. They only knew him as Mr. Lewis, the dependable man who listened more than he spoke. One afternoon, while cleaning a storage room at the maintenance office, Daniel paused as a radio broadcast played in the background. It was an interview with Adrian discussing post-wedding expansion plans. Success requires eliminating weakness, Adrian said confidently on air. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Weakness? Was compassion weakness? Had his experiment gone too far? He questioned himself for the first time in years. Perhaps he had mistaken distance for guidance. Perhaps absence had taught ambition without empathy. That night, Daniel sat at his small desk and wrote a letter. He didn't address it yet. He simply wrote memories. Adrian learning to ride a bicycle, Adrian crying after losing a school debate, Adrian promising at age 12 to build hospitals one day. Daniel folded the pages carefully and placed them inside an envelope along with several childhood photographs he had quietly kept. He stared at the envelope for a long time. The final phase had to begin. Back in Italy, Adrian stood alone on the beach one evening while Victoria slept. The waves crashed rhythmically against the shore. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt no triumph, only restlessness. Success had always felt sharp and energizing. Now it felt heavy. He told himself it was simply exhaustion from the wedding. But deep down, something else was stirring, something uncomfortable, something that questioned whether power without grace truly equals strength. 3 weeks after the wedding, Adrian returned to his penthouse office overlooking the city. Work consumed him immediately. Mergers pending, acquisitions underway, meetings stacked back-to-back. Efficiency was his antidote to discomfort. If he stayed busy, he wouldn't think. Late one evening, his assistant knocked gently on the glass door. This was delivered to reception, she said, placing a simple envelope on his desk. No return address, no branding, just his name written in careful handwriting. Adrian frowned slightly. He waited until the office emptied before opening it. Inside were several photographs. His breath caught instantly. The first photo showed him at age 8, sitting on his father's shoulders at a park. The second captured a messy science fair project, Daniel kneeling beside him proudly. The third was from his high school graduation, Daniel's arm wrapped tightly around him. Adrian sat down slowly. These were private family photos. Photos he hadn't seen in years. Beneath them lay folded pages of handwritten text. His chest tightened as he began to read. The letter did not accuse. It did not criticize. It simply described memories, teaching Adrian to swim, watching him defend a bullied classmate in middle school, hearing him once say, "I want to be strong enough to help people." The final lines were simple. Character is what you are when no one is watching. I have always believed you were stronger than you think. Adrian's hands trembled slightly. He didn't need a signature. He knew. The old man at the wedding, the voice, the eyes, the word son. A cold realization spread through him. His father wasn't bankrupt. He wasn't gone. He had been watching. Adrian leaned back in his chair, mind racing. If this was true, then everything he believed about the past decade shifted instantly. The humiliation at the wedding replayed in brutal clarity. Security gripping the old man's arm. His own voice ordering him out. Victoria's quiet disapproval. Adrian stood abruptly and walked to the window. The city lights glittered below like trophies. Suddenly, they looked different, not symbols of victory, but reflections of something hollow. He whispered to himself, "Why?" Not angrily, confused. Why would his father disappear? Why stage failure? Why watch silently? As the questions flooded in, Another realization struck harder. He had not hesitated long enough to ask who the man was. He had acted protect image, not truth. The office felt suffocating. Adrian grabbed his phone and dialed the only person who might know more, Margaret Wells, the family's longtime lawyer. When she answered, her silence on the other end confirmed everything before she even spoke. "It's time we talk," she said calmly. Adrian closed his eyes. The past 10 years were no longer a story of rebuilding from ashes. They were a test, and he had just begun to understand how badly he might have failed. Margaret Wells did not agree to meet at Adrian's office. Instead, she chose a quiet, private conference room in an older building downtown, neutral ground. When Adrian arrived, she was already seated, a leather folder placed neatly in front of her. She had aged over the decade, but her posture remained sharp, her gaze unwavering. Adrian closed the door behind him. "Tell me the truth," he said immediately. Margaret studied him carefully before speaking. "Your father never went bankrupt." The words landed heavily, though Adrian had already suspected them. Every asset was strategically protected. The collapse was engineered. Adrian let out a slow breath and ran a hand through his hair. "Engineered? You're telling me he destroyed his reputation on purpose." "He sacrificed his public image," Margaret corrected calmly, "not his empire." She opened the folder and slid several documents across the table. Trust agreements, ownership transfers, foundation charters bearing dates from 10 years ago. Adrian scanned them, his heartbeat steady but heavy. "Why?" he asked again, this time quieter. Margaret folded her hands. "Because he was afraid of losing you." That answer unsettled him more than any financial revelation. "Losing me? I was right there." "Physically," Margaret said, "not emotionally." Silence stretched between them. Margaret continued, "Your father believed wealth was shaping you in ways he did not like. He worried that comfort had replaced character. So he removed himself and the fortune from your reach." Adrian let out a humorless laugh. So this was a social experiment. It was a father's desperate attempt to see who his son would become without him. Adrian stood and began pacing. He let the world think he failed. He let me think he failed. Yes. He let me believe I had to rebuild alone. Margaret's voice softened slightly. "And you did." Adrian stopped pacing. That was true. He had built everything again. Harder, sharper, with something to prove. He watched from a distance, Margaret continued. He never interfered. Not in your investments. Not in your decisions. The wedding was the only time he stepped forward. Adrian's jaw tightened. The wedding. The memory felt sharper now, more exposed. "He came to see who I was," Adrian said slowly. Margaret nodded. "He came as no one important. No status. No power. Just a man." Adrian sank back into his chair, "And I had him thrown out." Margaret did not sugarcoat it. "Yes." The truth sat heavily between them. After a long silence, Adrian asked, "Where is he?" Margaret hesitated. "If I tell you, you must understand something. This was never about punishment. He loves you." Love. The word fell foreign in the context of boardrooms and negotiations. Adrian nodded once. "Tell me." Margaret slid a small card across the table. An address. A modest town he barely recognized. He works there. Lives there. By choice. Adrian stared at the address as if it were coordinates to an entirely different world. For the first time in years, he felt something that had nothing to do with business. It felt like regret. Adrian did not go immediately. For 3 days, he carried the address in his wallet without acting on it. He attended meetings, signed contracts, negotiated a merger worth hundreds of millions. Outwardly, nothing changed. Internally, everything had shifted. He began noticing things he once ignored. The fear in a junior employee's voice during presentations, the tension in rooms when he entered, the way executives agreed too quickly. Had they respected him, or simply feared him? Late one evening, Adrian asked his assistant to pull archive footage from the wedding. She looked surprised but complied. Alone in his office, Adrian watched the recording. The camera angle captured the moment clearly, the elderly man stepping forward, holding a small box, speaking quietly. Adrian saw himself from the outside now, rigid posture, impatient expression, quick glance around to measure who was watching. Then the words, "Remove him." He paused the video at the exact frame where the man, his father, said, "I'm proud of you, son." There was no anger in Daniel's face, only hope. That realization pierced deeper than humiliation. This had not been a trap. It had been an opportunity to choose differently. Adrian leaned back, staring at the frozen image. He had always defined strength as dominance, control, precision. But what if strength was restraint? What if power was measured not by who you could remove, but by who you chose to protect? Victoria entered quietly, noticing the tension in his shoulders. She looked at the pause screen and immediately understood. "You know now," she said gently. Adrian nodded. He was never bankrupt. Victoria walked closer. "I didn't think he was just some stranger." Adrian let out a slow breath. "He came to test me." "No," Victoria corrected softly. "He came because he's your father." That distinction mattered. Adrian swallowed hard. "I failed." Victoria didn't answer immediately. "You made a choice," she said. "Now you get to make another one." Adrian turned off the screen. For the first time in his adult life, he felt small, not because he lacked money, but because he lacked something money could not buy back. "Time. What would you do?" he asked her quietly. Victoria met his gaze. "I'd go find him. Not as CEO, not as Laurent, just as his son." The simplicity of that answer settled something inside him. The next morning, Adrian canceled his meetings for the rest of the week. His board was shocked. Investors questioned the sudden absence. Adrian offered no detailed explanation. For once, profit could wait. There was something more important at stake, something he had neglected for 10 years. The drive to the small town felt longer than any international flight Adrian had taken. He chose not to bring security, not to alert media. He drove himself in a modest car, dressed plainly for the first time in years. As the city skyline faded behind him, replaced by open highways and quiet neighborhoods, a strange anxiety crept in. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching. Yet this felt harder. The address led him to a simple apartment building beside a hardware store. No gates, no cameras, no marble floors. Adrian stepped out of the car slowly, absorbing the ordinariness of it all. Children rode bicycles nearby. An elderly couple watered plants on a balcony. Life here moved without headlines. He climbed the narrow staircase and stood in front of apartment 3B. For a moment, he considered turning back. What if his father refused to see him? What if disappointment had hardened into distance? Adrian raised his hand and knocked. Footsteps approached from inside, steady but unhurried. The door opened. Daniel stood there in a simple button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up, reading glasses resting low on his nose. For a few seconds, neither spoke. 10 years of silence filled the doorway. Adrian noticed the lines on his father's face, the roughness of his hands, the absence of luxury. Daniel noticed the tension in his son's eyes, the pride softened now by uncertainty. "Hello, Adrian," Daniel said calmly. "Not Mr. Laurent. Not surprise. Just recognition." Adrian's voice felt heavier than usual. "I know." Daniel stepped aside slightly. "Come in." The apartment was modest but tidy. A small bookshelf, a worn couch, a kettle whistling softly on the stove. Adrian looked around, absorbing the reality of how his father had lived. "You chose this?" Adrian asked quietly. Daniel poured 2 cups of tea before answering. "Yes." They sat across from each other at a small wooden table. No assistants, no lawyers, no cameras, just father and son. Adrian finally spoke the words that had been building since he opened the envelope. "Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel met his gaze steadily. "Because I needed to see who you would become without my shadow." Adrian clenched his jaw. "And the wedding?" Daniel's voice did not waver. "That was the only time I stepped forward. Not as a billionaire, not as a powerful man, just as someone you could have chosen to treat with kindness." The truth settled heavily between them. Adrian looked down at his hands. "I had you removed." Yes, Daniel said gently. No accusation, just acknowledgement. Silence followed, not hostile, but honest. Outside, a child's laughter echoed through the courtyard. Inside, something far more fragile was unfolding. For the first time in 10 years, they were no longer separated by wealth, pride, or illusion, only by truth. And truth, unlike money, could not be negotiated. Yes. News travels fast when power is involved, and even though neither Daniel nor Adrian called a press conference, the truth found its way into the world. It began with a quiet leak. An investigative journalist who had long questioned the mysterious collapse of Loron Holdings uncovered irregular financial trails that suggested the bankruptcy had never truly happened. Within days, headlines exploded across every major outlet. Billionaire Daniel Loron never lost his fortune. Disappeared by choice. Then came the deeper angle. Sources claim he tested his son for a decade. The wedding incident resurfaced. Someone had recorded the moment the old man was escorted out. This time, the clip slowed the audio just enough for the words to be unmistakable. "I'm proud of you, son." Social media erupted. Some praised Daniel as a genius father who sacrificed everything to teach a lesson about character. Others criticized him as manipulative, accusing him of emotional cruelty. Talk shows debated for hours. Psychologists weighed in. Business analysts speculated about succession battles. But what caught fire most intensely was the wedding footage. Millions watched Adrian's expression as he ordered security to remove the man. The comment sections were ruthless. Power without empathy. He became what his father feared. Money can't buy class. In his penthouse office, Adrian stared at the trending headlines in silence. He had faced public scrutiny before, market risks, controversial acquisitions. But this was different. This wasn't about business strategy. It was about who he was as a man. Victoria entered with her tablet in hand. "It's everywhere," she said softly. Adrian nodded. "Let it be." She looked at him carefully. "You're not going to deny it." "There's nothing to deny." His voice wasn't defensive. It was steady. "I made that choice. The world can see it." Across town, reporters gathered outside the small apartment building where Daniel lived. Cameras waited for a statement. Daniel stepped outside once, not in a tailored suit, but in his simple clothes. He spoke calmly. "This was never about humiliating my son. It was about understanding him, and understanding myself." "Do you regret it?" a reporter shouted. Daniel paused. "I regret any pain it caused, but I don't regret seeking truth." He refused to say anything negative about Adrian. That restraint surprised many. It shifted the narrative slightly. This wasn't a corporate scandal. It was a family reckoning. Back in the city, Adrian received calls from board members worried about investor confidence. "We need damage control," one insisted. Adrian leaned back in his chair. "There's no damage to control," he replied. "Continue operations as planned." For the first time in his career, Adrian wasn't calculating perception. He wasn't crafting statements. He was sitting with discomfort. And discomfort, he was beginning to understand, was not weakness. It was awareness. The backlash did not fade quickly. For weeks, Adrian's name trended alongside words like entitlement and arrogance. Old interviews resurfaced where he dismissed weakness and praised ruthless efficiency. They sounded harsher now, sharper. Stripped of context, they painted a picture of a man obsessed with power. One evening, unable to sleep, Adrian replayed the wedding footage again. This time he didn't focus on his father. He focused on himself. The tension in his posture, the quick glance around to see who was watching before he reacted. That glance haunted him. He hadn't removed the old man out of anger. He had removed him out of fear of appearing small in front of powerful people. That realization struck harder than public criticism. He had not protected the wedding. He had protected his image. Victoria found him sitting in the dark living room long after midnight. "You can't rewrite the moment," she said gently, sitting beside him. Adrian nodded slowly. "No, but I can understand it." He rubbed his hands together, a rare sign of vulnerability. "All these years, I thought strength meant never looking weak, but I've been afraid this entire time." Victoria listened quietly. "Afraid of what?" she asked. Adrian swallowed. of being like the version of him the world mocked. The failed billionaire. I thought if I showed softness, I'd lose everything. Victoria's voice was steady. You didn't lose everything. You lost perspective. The word settled deeply. Perspective. Adrian stood and walked toward the window overlooking the glittering skyline. He had built towers taller than his father's, closed deals faster, expanded wider. But somewhere along the way, he had narrowed himself. The next morning, instead of heading straight to the office, Adrian drove past one of his company's recently acquired properties, a manufacturing plant he had restructured the previous year. Hundreds had been laid off with minimal transition support. At the time, he called it necessary efficiency. Now he wondered about the faces behind those numbers. He asked his assistant for a list of employees impacted, not for PR, not for optics, just for himself. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his quiet routine, though the media storm had slightly disrupted the town's peace. Neighbors now knew who he had been. Some treated him with awe, others with curiosity. Daniel remained unchanged. He fixed a broken fence for a single mother down the street without accepting payment. He volunteered at the youth center, listening to teenagers talk about their fears of failure. He did not speak about billions. He spoke about integrity. The contrast between father and son grew clearer in the public eye. But privately, something in Adrian was shifting. The breakdown was not explosive. It was gradual, a slow cracking of pride. And beneath the cracks, something long buried began to breathe again. 3 weeks after their first meeting in the small apartment, Adrian returned, this time without hesitation. He didn't call ahead. He simply drove back to the quiet town, parked in the same unmarked space, and climbed the narrow stairs to 3B. When Daniel opened the door, there was no surprise in his eyes, only patience. "You came back," Daniel said. Adrian nodded. "I wasn't finished." Daniel stepped aside, and they sat again at the small wooden table. No tea this time. No formalities. Adrian leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I've been thinking about the plant in Westbridge," he began. Daniel listened silently. "We cut 300 jobs in a week. I told myself it was necessary. Maybe it was. But I never asked what happened after." Daniel's voice was calm. "Did you want to know?" Adrian hesitated. "No, I wanted growth charts." The honesty hung between them. Daniel didn't criticize. He simply asked, "And now?" Adrian looked around the modest apartment, the peeling paint, the simple furniture. "Now I'm starting to understand what 10 years without insulation feels like." Daniel studied him carefully. "It wasn't meant to punish you." "I know," Adrian replied. "It showed me something. I just didn't want to see it." Silence followed, but it was no longer heavy. It was reflective. Adrian continued, "I thought if I built something bigger than what you had, I'd prove I was stronger. But strength isn't volume. It's weight." Daniel's eyes softened slightly. "What do you intend to do with that understanding?" Adrian exhaled slowly. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." Later that afternoon, Adrian walked through the town alone. He passed a hardware store, the small diner, the community center where Daniel volunteered. Through the window, he saw his father helping a teenager fill out a job application, speaking with patient encouragement. No cameras, no recognition, just quiet impact. For the first time, Adrian understood what his father had been measuring all along. Not profit, not dominance, but who he was when there was nothing to gain. That evening, before driving back to the city, Adrian stopped at a local bank and made a private donation to the community center, anonymous, unrestricted. It was a small act compared to his wealth, but it felt different from corporate philanthropy. It wasn't strategy. It was responsibility. As he pulled onto the highway, the skyline waiting in the distance no longer felt like a throne to defend. It felt like a platform to reconsider. And for the first time in years, Adrian wasn't focused on being bigger than his father. He was focused on becoming worthy of him. The third visit was different. Adrian did not come with questions about business decisions or public backlash. He came with something heavier, truth he had avoided for most of his adult life. Daniel was repairing a loose cabinet hinge in his apartment when Adrian knocked. "Come in," Daniel said without turning around. Adrian stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He didn't sit this time. He remained standing, hands in his coat pockets, as if bracing himself. "I need to ask you something," Adrian began. Daniel finished tightening the hinge before facing him fully. "Ask." Adrian's voice was steady but lower than usual. "Did you ever think I would pass?" The question lingered in the small room. Daniel did not rush his answer. "I hoped you would," he said honestly. "But hope and certainty are not the same." Adrian nodded slowly. "When you stood there at the wedding, why didn't you stop them? Why didn't you just say who you were?" Daniel's eyes held no bitterness. "Because the moment would have changed. If I revealed myself, your reaction would have been about status again. I needed to see what you would do when you believed I had none." The simplicity of that answer struck deep. Adrian swallowed. "And when I failed?" Daniel stepped closer, not as a billionaire judging an heir, but as a father facing a son. "You didn't fail permanently. You failed in a moment. Moments reveal us, but they don't have to define us." Adrian looked down at the floor. "I humiliated you." "Yes," Daniel said gently. "No anger, just truth. But I also humiliated you first." Adrian looked up, surprised. Daniel continued. "I created a lie. I let you believe I was weak. I let the world mock our name. I thought I was teaching strength. Perhaps I also taught pride." The admission shifted something in the air. Adrian had expected criticism, not accountability. "You sacrificed everything," Adrian said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "No, I sacrificed image. There's a difference." Silence followed, but it was no longer defensive. It was honest. Adrian finally said the words he had never spoken before. "I was ashamed of you." Daniel absorbed that without flinching. "I know. I thought if people saw you as a failure, they'd see me the same way." His voice cracked slightly. "So I removed you." Daniel stepped closer and placed a hand on Adrian's shoulder. Firm, steady. "You were protecting your identity. The problem was you built that identity on fear." The truth landed clean and sharp. Adrian exhaled slowly. "I don't want to lead like that anymore." Daniel studied him. "Then don't." There was no dramatic embrace, no swelling music, just two men standing in a modest apartment, choosing honesty over ego. For the first time in 10 years, they were not measuring each other. They were understanding each other. Adrian returned to the city with a clarity that felt unfamiliar. The board meeting scheduled that week was expected to finalize an aggressive acquisition that would eliminate nearly 500 positions across 3 states. In the past, Adrian would have approved it without hesitation. This time, he asked for a full social impact report. The executive shifted uncomfortably. "Our responsibility is to shareholders," one board member reminded him. Adrian's voice remained calm. "Our responsibility is also to sustainability. Short-term dominance can weaken long-term stability." It was a different tone, not softer, but broader. After the meeting, Adrian called for a private session with his executive team. "From this point forward," he said, "we build profit without stripping dignity. Restructuring will include transition programs, retraining investments, and executive pay caps during layoffs." The room went silent. Some were skeptical, others surprised. Adrian didn't frame it as charity. He framed it as strength. That evening, he drove again to the small town, unannounced. Daniel was at the community center, helping organize donated books. Adrian stood in the doorway for a moment, watching teenagers laugh as Daniel showed them how to repair a broken shelf. No one there treated him like a legend. They treated him like a neighbor. When Daniel noticed Adrian, he walked over with quiet curiosity. "You look different," Daniel observed. Adrian nodded slightly. "I made changes today." They stepped outside into the cool evening air. "Not symbolic ones," Adrian continued. "Structural ones." Daniel listened without interruption. "I used to think leadership meant control," Adrian said. "Now I think it means stewardship." Daniel's eyes reflected something close to relief. "Money magnifies character," he said softly. "It doesn't create it." Adrian gave a faint smile. "You wrote that to me once." Daniel nodded. and I had to relearn it myself. Adrian looked toward the horizon where the sun was setting beyond the modest rooftops. I don't want to erase the past, he said. I want to grow from it. Daniel placed his hands in his pockets. Growth is slower than ambition, but it lasts longer. The next few weeks were not dramatic, but they were deliberate. Adrian established an internal ethics council within his company. He personally met with former employees affected by previous layoffs. Some meetings were tense, some painful. He did not defend his past decisions. He listened. Word began to spread, not through flashy press releases, but through quiet shift in company culture. Investors noticed stability. Employees noticed accessibility. It wasn't perfection. It was progression. Months passed, and the storm of media speculation gradually faded. The world moved on to new scandals, new headlines. But inside the Lauron story, transformation continued steadily. Adrian proposed something unexpected during one of his visits to Daniel's apartment. "I want you to come back," he said. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "Back where?" "Not to run the company," Adrian clarified, "but to stand beside me publicly, not as a symbol of redemption, as a partner in purpose." Daniel considered the idea carefully. "Why?" Adrian answered without hesitation. "Because hiding you is rooted in shame. Honoring you must be rooted in truth." A few weeks later, a joint event was announced. Not a luxury gala, but a foundation launch focused on mentorship programs for young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged communities. No extravagant fireworks, no celebrity performances, just a stage, a modest crowd, and a message. When Daniel walked onto that stage beside Adrian, cameras flashed, but this time the attention felt different. Adrian stepped to the microphone first. The room quieted. 10 years ago, he began, I believed success meant never appearing weak. I believed power meant distance. I was wrong. Murmurs moved through the audience. Adrian continued, voice steady. My father taught me that wealth without character is fragile. I didn't understand that lesson when it mattered most. I understand it now. Then he stepped aside and allowed Daniel to speak. Daniel did not recount the humiliation. He did not describe the test. He simply said, every generation faces a choice, to build higher walls or longer tables. The applause was not explosive. It was thoughtful, sincere. After the event, as guests mingled and young entrepreneurs signed up for mentorship programs, Adrian and Daniel stood slightly apart from the crowd. This isn't about repairing image, Adrian said quietly. I know, Daniel replied. It's about repairing foundation. Adrian nodded. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to be bigger than his father. He felt stronger standing beside him. And Daniel, watching his son speak not with dominance but with depth, understood something equally important. The experiment had not created a perfect man. It had revealed a willing one. And willingness to change was worth more than any empire they could ever build. The foundation grew quietly but steadily. It did not rely on spectacle. It relied on substance. Within 6 months, mentorship hubs opened in 3 cities, pairing seasoned executives with young entrepreneurs from underprivileged neighborhoods. Grants were offered, not as charity, but as partnership capital. Workshops focused on ethics as much as expansion. Adrian personally attended the first few sessions without announcing his presence publicly. He sat in circles, listening to 20-year-olds pitch ideas with nervous hands and hopeful eyes. One evening, a young man named Marcus presented a proposal for a logistics startup aimed at hiring formerly incarcerated individuals. His voice trembled as he explained the stigma they faced. Years ago, Adrian would have evaluated the numbers first, the risk exposure, the margins. This time, he asked a different question. What kind of culture do you want to build? Marcus blinked, surprised. One where people aren't defined by their worst mistake, he replied. The answer lingered in the room. Adrian nodded slowly. Then protect that culture before you protect profit. Daniel, sitting quietly in the back, observed the exchange without interrupting. There was no prideful smile, no dramatic reaction, just a quiet recognition that the lesson had taken root. Later that night, father and son walked outside the center together. The city air was cool, the streets humming with ordinary life. "You didn't take control of the room," Daniel said casually. Adrian gave a small smile. "I didn't need to." They walked in silence for a few steps before Adrian spoke again. "4 years, I thought leadership meant being the strongest voice. Now I think it means asking the right questions." Daniel glanced at him. Questions create space. Power often fills it too quickly. Adrian nodded, absorbing that. The foundation's impact began drawing attention, not for scandal, but for results. Employee retention in Adrian's company improved after structural reforms. Productivity increased where dignity was prioritized. Investors who once doubted his shift now saw long-term resilience. The market responded not with volatility, but with trust. One afternoon, Adrian visited a manufacturing plant in Westbridge, the same one where hundreds had once been laid off abruptly. This time, the company had reopened a retraining center on-site, funded jointly by the foundation. Some of the very workers who had lost jobs were now instructors, teaching new technical skills to others. Adrian walked through the facility without cameras. An older worker recognized him. For a tense second, Adrian expected resentment. Instead, the man extended his hand. "Appreciate the second chance," he said simply. Adrian shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for taking it." The exchange was brief but profound. Redemption, Adrian realized, was not about erasing past decisions. It was about building forward with accountability. That evening, Adrian drove back to the small town one more time, not because he needed guidance, but because it had become part of who he was. He and Daniel sat on the worn apartment balcony overlooking the quiet street below. "Do you ever regret it?" Adrian asked suddenly. "The 10 years." Daniel considered the question carefully. "Regret is too simple a word," he said. "It cost us time, but it gave us truth." Adrian looked out at the streetlights glowing softly. "I used to think wealth was inheritance," he said. "Now I think wisdom is." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The transformation was no longer fragile. It was lived. A year after the wedding that almost defined him, Adrian stood once again before a large audience. But this time, there were no fireworks, no orchestras, no luxury spectacle. It was the annual summit for ethical leadership hosted by the foundation. Entrepreneurs, educators, community leaders, and executives filled the hall. Daniel sat in the front row, not as a hidden observer, but as a present father. Adrian approached the podium without notes. He no longer relied on scripted dominance. "There was a time," he began, "when I believed success meant never appearing small. I believed strength meant control, speed, and distance." The audience listened intently. "But the day I felt most powerful in my life," Adrian continued, "was actually the day I was most afraid." He paused, letting the weight of that settle. Afraid of being judged, afraid of being associated with weakness, afraid of losing status. His voice remained steady, but vulnerable. "That fear cost me something far more valuable than reputation. It cost me perspective." Across the room, Daniel watched quietly, remembering the young boy who once promised to build hospitals, who once defended classmates from bullies. That boy had not disappeared. He had simply been buried beneath expectation and ego. Adrian went on, "True wealth is not measured by what you can remove from your life. It's measured by what you choose to protect, even when no one is watching." The line echoed gently through the hall. He did not recount the humiliation publicly. He did not dramatize the past. He simply acknowledged growth. When the applause rose, it wasn't explosive. It was sustained, respectful. After the summit, as attendees dispersed into conversations and new partnerships, Adrian stepped down from the stage and walked directly to his father. No cameras followed. No headlines captured the moment. Adrian extended his hand first, but Daniel ignored it and pulled him into a firm embrace. It wasn't grand. It wasn't theatrical. It was earned. "You didn't build something bigger than me," Daniel said quietly. "You built something better." Adrian felt his throat tighten slightly. "I built it because you stepped away." Daniel shook his head. "No, you built it because you chose to see." Outside the venue, the skyline shimmered once more. The same towers, The same lights, but they no longer symbolize dominance. They symbolize responsibility. As they walked out together, not billionaire and heir, but father and son, the past no longer stood between them as a test. It stood behind them as a lesson. And the final truth was simple. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what truly matters. Not power, not image, not applause, but character when no one is watching.